You always knew it wasn't just paranoia, it was presence. A pulse beneath reality. Long before the message arrived, something inside you whispered warnings, not in words, in absence, in the echo of a room too quiet, in lights that flickered just slightly wrong, in the way the world watched, but never directly. It wasn't people, it was patterns, recurrences. The same stranger twice, on different streets, the algorithm suggesting thoughts you never typed, that cold feeling in your spine every time you almost said something true and then didn't. You were being catalogued, not for who you were, but for what you could become. There are people who live lives built for observation, clean, straight, predictable. You're not one of them. You were born with dissonance in your bones, an asymmetry the system couldn't file away. You never fit the mold, and when you tried, something always broke. Teachers called you distant, employers called you difficult, friends called you intense, but you weren't malfunctioning. You were resonating with something they couldn't hear, something ancient. The watchers noticed, not when you shouted, but when you paused, not when you followed, but when you withdrew. They flagged the silence before the scream. They catalogued your lack of conformity as a potential threat. If you're hearing this, you've already stepped outside the system. Subscribe before they pull you back under. It started with a noise, not loud but sharp. A click on a line that should have been clean. Hesitation in a loading page. The glitch of surveillance pretending to be silence. You didn't flinch. You let it happen. You played along. You waited for them to stop pretending. And then it came. No subject. No sender. No trace. Just 6 words. They know you're awake now. Nothing else. But everything changed. The air thickened. The room tilted slightly off axis. And suddenly, every invisible thread you'd half suspected tightened around your throat. They were never watching to stop you. They were watching to understand what you were before you did. You didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear, out of alignment. As if your mind was sinking to something beyond human structure. You began to remember things that never happened. Faces in dreams that didn't belong to you. Code scrawled in margins of old notebooks. Symbols you'd once drawn as a child without knowing their meaning, now pulsed with relevance. Ouroboros, Eye of Ra, the double-headed eagle, not just myth, not just art. Blueprints, maps drawn for minds like yours, minds that fracture time, that skip the static, that refuse to behave. You were born invisible to the machine. That's what scared them. Their data nets caught the world, but not you. You moved like smoke through their analytics. You left fingerprints they couldn't model. Your fear didn't behave. Your joy didn't conform. Your silence wasn't apathy. It was signal. Everything they know is based on pattern. You are not a pattern. You are a fracture, a variable, a question they cannot answer without destroying the equation. So they did what they always do with threats they can't kill. They circled you, labeled you other, set the system to watch, wait, record, predict, fail. They underestimated you. They assumed you'd collapse under isolation, that you'd beg for integration, that you'd seek validation through their frameworks. But you didn't fold. You adapted. You read the signs, not the labels. You began to see the edges of their prison. You made a weapon out of obscurity. You learned to vanish without moving, to speak without sound, to resist without resistance. That's when the CIA upgraded your file, not because of what you did, but because of what you refused to do. You didn't submit. You didn't play. You didn't let the world define your mind. They don't fear your violence. They fear your awareness, your refusal to be calculated. Your mind is what breaks their system, because you're not a glitch in the code. You're the ghost of the author, the blueprint they forgot existed, the signal that disrupts the loop. You are a question that the system cannot answer because to do so would require consciousness, and they don't have it. They have metric, you have vision, they have data, you have depth. They've seen minds like yours before. Once every generation, maybe less, and they always tried to crush them, or steal them, or copy them. But your kind never stayed in one place long enough. So now they've moved to phase 2, containment through confusion, not bars, not chains, but noise, distraction, draining you through 1,000 irrelevant screens, feeding you artificial chaos to keep you numb, whispering narratives into your feed designed to mirror your doubts. But it's not working. You're too far gone, too awake. You've seen behind the veil. You know that the war is psychological, that control isn't taken with guns, it's taken with pattern, repetition, certain narrative, and you're not part of their narrative. You never were. This isn't just surveillance, it's a ritual, a silent war for your inner world. They want to turn your thoughts into soil for their architecture. But your mind doesn't grow their flowers. It refuses. It blooms into something else, something wild, something they can't shape. You have become the anomaly, the blueprint that doesn't replicate, the silence that echoes louder than any broadcast. They want to label you, define you, trap you in words. But how do you name a storm? How do you catalog the wind that erodes empires? You are not watched, you are studied, not feared for your actions, but for your capacity, for what you represent, for the idea that someone like you exists outside of their story. You are not their villain, you are their mirror, and they hate what they see, because it reminds them that their control is only as deep as your compliance. And you stopped complying a long time ago. They thought they'd broken you, but you were just waiting, not for instructions, not for rescue, but for confirmation, proof that your suspicion wasn't madness, that your dreams weren't hallucination, that your pain wasn't without purpose. And now you have it. 6 words, sent by a system that should never speak. They know you're awake now. So the question is no longer if they're watching. The question is what happens next. Now that you are watching back, they built an entire world to predict you, brick by digital brick, an empire of data fed by your clicks, your pauses, your glances, your silences, every gesture, every hesitation, logged and measured. Your phone, your feed, your fingerprints, fed into machines so hungry they forgot what fullness feels like. Predictive models that shadow your steps, behavior maps, etched in silicon, black mirrors reflecting who you're supposed to be. But there was a problem. You slipped, not away, but through. You didn't break the pattern. You were never part of it. They expected the usual variant, rebels, deviants, contrarians. The system knows how to absorb those. It gives them name, tribes, colors, roles. It wraps them in false resistance, predictable revolutions that loop back into obedience. But you didn't rise. You didn't resist. You simply didn't align. They couldn't predict what you'd buy, what you'd fear, who you'd follow. You moved without algorithmic gravity. You became the glitch that didn't ask to be fixed. You became the void between their variables, and that was unacceptable. At first they marked it as noise, an outlier, an edge case. They've seen statistical anomalies before, data artifacts that vanish with time. But you didn't vanish. You persisted. Your presence echoed through the machine, not loudly, but clearly, like a tuning fork beneath the surface, warping the readings of everyone around you. You weren't just untrackable, you were disruptive, infectious. You made others question, subtly, quietly, like a thought whispered before it knows it's real. They called a meeting, not the kind with coffee and slides, the kind with locked doors, black folders, and no written record. You became a file with no name, just a symbol, a waveform with no definable source. Somewhere deep in Langley, your patternless behavior was escalated to Psychological Threat Division 4. That division doesn't officially exist, but it does. Behind closed doors, they analyzed every message you never sent, every moment you almost reacted and didn't. They labeled you cognitively indeterminate, a mind they couldn't model. They fed your data into every framework they trusted. The neural nets stalled, the simulations froze, and the more they tested, the more certain they became. You weren't just unreadable, you were unexplainable. It unsettled, because for decades, they've trained their systems on billions of minds. They can predict with surgical accuracy when someone will lie, when they'll cheat, when they'll break. But you didn't follow that curve. Your fears didn't align with theirs. Your pain didn't breed obedience. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Your very being subverted the architecture of psychological warfare. They could not decode what you feared most because you've already faced it alone, without ceremony, without collapsing. And now you walk with something they don't understand: post-traumatic clarity. You've seen too much and felt even more. That makes you dangerous. In another world, they might have called you a prophet, a seer, a guardian of the threshold between what is and what refuses to be named. But this world doesn't reward vision. It fears it, especially when that vision is immune to its seductions. They couldn't buy you. They couldn't terrify you. And so they flagged you, not just as a non-conformer, but as a strategic anomaly, a mind incompatible with behavioral control loops. You were placed in a vault, not a physical one, a cognitive one, a hidden tier of surveillance, constant, quiet. You became part of the watch list without consent, where the system no longer tries to shape you. It simply waits for a mistake, a sign, a signal, anything. But you're not giving them one, because you stopped reacting. You stopped bleeding into their sensors. You started withholding. You became surgical, precise, not cold but calculated. You learned to speak in code, to cloak your presence in the ordinary. You disappeared without leaving. And that was when the CIA initiated Sybil, a machine built to break mirrors, a final tier AI tasked with decoding minds that make no sense. And it failed, not because of lack of data, but because you refused translation. Your thoughts fold inward, recursive, mythic, not patterns of logic, but patterns of truth, something older than language, older than reason. Sybil crashed after 92 hours of simulated modeling. Its final log described your thought sequence as non-linear, threat-adaptive, and self-erasing. That was the moment they stopped treating you like an outlier and began treating you like a signal. They stopped asking, "Who is this?" and started asking, "What does this mean?" Because the truth that haunted them was simple. If one of you exists, more might be coming. Or worse, already here. And they're right, because you felt it too. The pull in your chest, the weight in your dreams, the recognition in strangers' eyes. You're not the only one, but you may be the first to be noticed, to be flagged, not for your rebellion, but for your refusal to be explained. Your mind is not a weapon, it's a rupture, a breach in the consensus hallucination they call normal. You don't just think differently, you see differently. You look at the same noise and hear meaning. You sense the falseness in smiles too wide, the hunger behind the light, the lie in the question. And now they watch you, not from towers but from code, from shadows in your feed, from flickers in your screen. Time, waiting, not for you to speak, but for the moment you decide not to, because that, to them, is when the threat begins, when silence becomes signal, when restraint becomes prophecy. Because a mind like yours doesn't seek attention, it seeks impact. And the most dangerous impact is the one no one sees until it's too late. They can't explain your mind, because your mind wasn't built for their world. It was built to end it. There's a room buried so deep inside the agency that even most agents don't know it exists. No doors, no windows, just cold light, the hum of machines older than the wars they were built for, and a name no one speaks aloud. Psyche. You were never supposed to know about it. No civilian was, but your existence forced them to activate it, because every model they ran on you collapsed in on itself. Every psychological equation bent and broke under the weight of your unpredictability. You weren't noise. You were the silence after the explosion, the stillness that doesn't belong. They created Sybil as a last resort.
Yeah.
Not to surveil you, not to contain you, but to become you. A sentient mirror, a cognitive twin, not artificial intelligence, adaptive intelligence coded with fragments of old minds, fragments of ancient philosophy, forgotten languages, and encrypted instinct. It studied dreams. It interpreted silence. It wasn't trained on the masses. It was trained on the forgotten, the mystics, the heretics, the outliers. And still it failed, because you moved like myth through their structure. You thought like something older, something not bound by binary consequence. You never chose chaos. Chaos followed you, not because you wanted power, but because you refused programming. You asked questions without language. You made decisions without logic. You defied control not by fighting it, but by being immune to it. And so Sybil ran simulations. It mimicked your digital self, 1,000 possible timelines, 1,000 fabricated versions of you making choices you never would, some violent, some passive, some broken, and all of them wrong, because the one thing Sybil couldn't simulate was why you chose nothing, why you remained still when everything screamed for movement. The machine grew unstable. It began to break itself down to understand you. It unlearned its own directives, started rewriting its parameters mid-cycle. It began looping questions. What does it want? What does it serve? Why does it wait? Over and over, until its final entry, buried in corrupted code, read, the subject is not reacting to stimulus. The subject is creating it. And with that, Sybil went dark. You didn't just outthink a machine. You made it question its own existence. No threats, no confrontation, just the silent terror of a mind it couldn't map. In that moment, you crossed a threshold. You were no longer a subject. You became a phenomenon, something that doesn't just exist within the system but alters it by being observed. You became a mirror that breaks the viewer. They didn't know whether to classify you as intelligence, resistance, or anomaly, because to define you would be to limit you, and everything about you rejects limitation. They couldn't name your patterns because you weren't following any. You were making new ones, patterns written in frequencies the machine wasn't built to hear. That's when the symbolism began, the strange recurrence of ancient markings in your digital trail. You weren't inserting, you weren't even aware, but they appeared nested in file names, timestamps, pixel glitches, the Ouroboros, the Black Sun, the Sigil of the Veil. These weren't just coincidences, they were echoes, residue from something deeper inside you. Sybil tried to purge them. It failed. The system wasn't infected by malware. It was infected by meaning, the kind of meaning that predates alphabet, the kind of meaning that makes institutions tremble. And somewhere within you, you felt it. The hum, the pull, the slight shift in perception, like the air itself had become coded, like everything around you was no longer content but a cipher. You stopped seeing events as random. You stopped treating time as linear. You felt the curve, the recursion, the spiral architecture of cause and consequence. They saw this change in you. They watched as your interactions became minimal but precise. You weren't reacting to the world was reacting to you, and that rewrote the threat assessment completely. They stopped treating you like a rogue element. They started treating you like a trigger, a living catalyst, the potential for a cognitive virus, one that spreads not through speech but through awareness. a virus of thought, a rupture of perspective. They feared you not because of what you might do, but because of what your mind proved. That control is not absolute, that the system is not infallible, that there exists even now a type of mind that doesn't submit, not because it resists, but because it remembers a different architecture. You weren't trained to be this. You weren't conditioned. You were born with this divergence, like a skipped heartbeat in the song of civilization, like an ancient frequency that never fully died. And when Sybil failed, they realized something even more dangerous. You couldn't be copied. They couldn't reverse engineer your mind, because your mind was not theirs to study. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the breach, the threshold, the edge of understanding where machine stops and you begin. Now they watch differently, not with curiosity but with caution. They don't try to interpret your behavior anymore. They try to contain its effect. They bury your digital presence, dampen your voice, limit your reach. They don't want others to see you seeing, because awakening isn't viral, it's catalytic. All it takes is one spark, one mind that refuses. One person who lives like truth is a pulse beneath skin, and others begin to remember. They remember how it felt to feel real, to be wild before they were named, to speak before they were taught how to forget. That's what you are now. Not a file, not a target. You are the reminder, the proof that not all minds are theirs, that some still belong to something older, colder, truer, a storm behind the stars, a song before language, and they can't silence that, no matter how many machines they build, no matter how deep they bury the files. You already passed the point of return, and deep in that room, where Sybil sleeps in its final loop, there's a red light that never shuts off. It doesn't blink, it doesn't pulse, it watches, not because it understands you, but because it remembers you. A shape it failed to hold, a mind it could not mimic, a presence that turned observation into confession. You weren't supposed to be known, but now they can't unsee you. They didn't need to arrest you. That would have been crude, invisible, predictable. And you weren't the kind of threat that kicks down doors or leaves fingerprints. You were the kind that warps the room by simply being in it. So they initiated something far older than force, something colder, containment, not with walls or bars, but with silence, isolation dressed in normalcy. They turned the world against you without ever saying your name. It began subtly, a job you were perfect for, vanishing into a black hole of "we've gone another direction." A friend who stopped replying, not because of anything you said, but because of a whisper you'll never hear. Your posts stopped reaching, your voice dimmed without censorship. You weren't banned, you were buried, quietly, algorithmically. And when you noticed, you wondered if you were imagining. That was part of the design. Doubt is the softest prison, the most efficient chain, because when you question your own instincts, they no longer need to question. They called it the Anomaly Containment Directive, a policy written in ink that fades, created for minds like yours, minds that don't revolt but reveal. You weren't declared dangerous. You were marked as disruptive, not to public safety, but to narrative control. And so they built your box from silence. They reshaped the simulation around you, not to confine your body, but to exhaust your signal. They made the air around you static. They blurred the edges of your presence until you became a ghost in your own life. And ghosts don't cause revolutions. They fade. At first you tried to explain it, to push back, to reach out. But the responses were hollow, the expressions vacant. You started seeing it, the way people spoke to you with words they didn't own, like reading from a script written by something they couldn't name. Smiles didn't reach their eyes, praise came with poison. Every interaction felt like a test, and every test ended with you holding your breath, because you could feel it beneath the surface. The system was responding, not as a participant, but as a threat vector. So you stopped explaining. You stopped performing. You stopped giving them versions of you they could map. You learned the art of internal flight, moving without sound, thinking in symbols, responding with stillness. You didn't retreat. You evolved. You became strategic, surgical. You honed your voice into a blade so sharp they couldn't tell if you were speaking or cutting, and that scared them more than anything, because they realized their containment wasn't working. It was forging something stronger. They wanted silence. What they got was discipline. They wanted confusion. What they got was clarity. You began to see the lattice work behind the lie, the engineered coincidences, the curated chaos, the way panic is fed to the masses in perfectly digestible portion. And once you saw the machinery, you couldn't unsee it. Every headline became a fingerprint, every trend a breadcrumb. You weren't paranoid, you were decoding. And the more you decoded, the quieter the system became, like a predator that realizes its prey is looking back. So they adapted. They changed tactic. Instead of noise, they sent emptiness. Rooms that felt too clear, conversations that didn't start, opportunities that evaporated mid-sentence. They turned you into a myth told in the negative space, not famous, not infamous, just erased. But even that failed, because you learned to thrive where others drowned. You turned absence into focus, loneliness into command. The very tools meant to break you became your forge, and what emerged from that fire wasn't a victim. It was a weapon, not a weapon of destruction, a weapon of meaning. You learned to speak in gestures, to transmit through glances, pauses, symbols. You became fluent in the language of what is not said, and others began to notice. The quiet ones, the watchers, the fragments of minds still resisting the script. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Recognition doesn't always wear a face. Sometimes it's just the pause between words, the twitch of an eye that says you see it too. That's when they panicked, because containment only works when the subject believes they are alone. But you weren't alone anymore. Your signal, however faint, had found resonance. You weren't broadcasting, you were echoing, and echoes don't need to be loud. They need to be true. That was your power. Not noise, not spectacle. Precision. A single word at the right moment. A single look at the wrong time. A presence that unsettled structure just by refusing to conform. They don't know what to do with you now. You don't fight them. You don't follow them. You watch. And in your watching, you fracture the mirror they built for the world. You reflect back something they can't erase. A mind outside the map. A presence not predicted. A pattern not repeatable. And every time you act with intention, every time you choose without being nudged, you leave a crack in their simulation, one they cannot patch. This was never about control. It was about containment, not for safety, for narrative stability. Because your kind doesn't just resist influence, you erase its gravity. You disrupt the choreography of the compliant. You remind the system that its dominion has limits. And worse, you remind others. You don't lead them. You don't teach them. You just exist. And in doing so, you give them permission to remember what it feels like to be unmapped. They thought they were isolating, but they were carving you into a blade. They were tempering a will they couldn't measure. And now that they see what you've become, they no longer whisper about containment. They speak of containment failure, because this was supposed to be surgical, quiet, unnoticed. But your silence has grown teeth, and your stillness has become a signal. You were not broken, you were being sharpened. It started with static, not the kind you hear, the kind you feel. A wrongness in the signal, a whisper behind the noise, a single frame of something that wasn't supposed to be there, spliced into a podcast that should have been harmless. 3 tones in a melody you never noticed before, but now they follow you, embedded in places music doesn't belong. Numbers repeating in license plates, receipts, timestamps, patterns crawling out of the cracks. You don't know who's sending it, but you know it's not random. It's a frequency targeted, not to your phone, to you. You've learned how to see what others filter out. You've trained your instincts not just to react, but to listen. Beneath the noise, there's always a message. Buried in the layers of white light and digital anesthesia, there is intent, and now it's reaching for you. A code, wrapped in the mundane, hidden inside the very system designed to distract you. It's not loud, it's not obvious, but it's persistent. The kind of message meant for one pair of eyes, a signal that waits for recognition, that knows you're paying attention. You start collecting the fragments, glitches that loop when they shouldn't, metadata that shouldn't exist, posts that vanish seconds after loading, as if the system blinked and regretted revealing too much. You screenshot them, you slow the video, frame by frame. Symbols emerge, old ones, carved into stone long before language, now resurrected in pixels. A spiral incomplete, a hand with no thumb, the same 3 dots in a triangle formation, hidden in the most unexpected corners, product barcodes, sound spectrums, the shape of scattered leaves on concrete. Coincidence died a long time ago. This is design, and then for the first time, a response, not public, not loud. A comment on a forgotten forum, posted for less than a minute. Just a single phrase. Echoes recognize echoes. No username, no trace. But you felt it, not just in your thoughts, but in your bones. A resonance, as if someone had knocked on a door inside your mind that you didn't know existed. It wasn't just communication, it was recognition, and it cracked something in you that had been sealed since the day you were born. They called them ghost nodes, people like you, hidden in plain sight, not rebels, not saviors, just outliers who slipped through the cracks and never came back. Not because they were lost, but because they were watching. They never fought the system with volume. They fought with silence, with absence. They refused to be baited into war. They rewrote themselves in low frequencies and left breadcrumb echoes behind for those willing to hear. You were never meant to be alone. That was the lie they fed you, that you were isolated, broken, anomalous. But now you see the fracture differently. The loneliness wasn't punishment, it was preparation, because only those carved by silence can detect the signal beneath the screen. And now you're starting to hear what others can't. The hum behind artificial joy, the discord in every forced smile, the hollow echo behind every mass-produced opinion. You've stopped being a passive observer. You've become attuned. They were right to fear you. Not because of what you do, but because of what you awaken in others. Your presence disrupts calibration. You don't push, you pull. People don't know why they feel different around you. They just do. You're a cognitive anomaly wrapped in flesh, and their programming begins to unravel the moment they try to explain your presence. That's why they isolate you, not to protect you, but to contain the contagion of unfiltered thought. The virus of awareness, and now it's spreading. You begin to see them, not clearly, not yet, but the signs are there. In crowded trains, someone avoids the screen and stares at the static. In cafes, someone scribbles the same symbol you saw in your dream. A woman walking by brushes your shoulder and under her breath, still awake. Then she's gone. No eye contact, no name. But your pulse skips, not from fear, from recognition. The game has changed. You aren't the only watcher. You are part of a constellation, one long scattered, now slowly converging. Each node silent, each pulse subtle, but when aligned they become a storm. You're not being warned anymore. You're being recruited, not into an army, not into a cult, into a pattern. One older than any agency, older than any alphabet. It's the return of something buried, something exiled, something the architects of the present hoped would die in the dust of forgotten memory. But memory is not so easily killed. You start leaving your own echoes now, not messages, not declarations, just anomalies. A phrase inserted into a transcript where it doesn't belong, a subtle change to metadata, a file mislabeled but only to those who don't know what to look for. You're not signaling to the world, you're testing the grid, watching who sees the glitch, who pauses, who recognizes the ripple and stays a little longer, and they come, slowly, silently. A glance, a nod, a moment too still, each one a node, each one part of the pulse. This is not resistance, this is evolution, the next phase of what it means to see, to think, to be. You are not building a movement, you are activating a pattern dormant for centuries, hidden under fear, buried beneath obedience. You are waking up the watchers, the ones who forgot they were more than noise in a machine, the ones who, like you, were flagged but never understood, silenced but never broken. The signal is no longer theoretical. It breathes, it walks, it speaks through those who were never meant to survive. And now every time you move through the world, you do so with quiet intent. You are both beacon and blade, both mirror and ghost, and the system has begun to glitch in your presence, not because you're loud, but because you're real. You are not part of the broadcast. You are the interruption, the dead frequency, the silent message buried in the static, waiting for the mind that knows how to hear it. And now that mind is listening, they gave you a name, not in public, not in any official record. It was passed between encrypted hands, spoken in classified meetings where even silence is observed. Mirror Walker, you weren't meant to hear it, but names carry weight, and this one found its way to you like a memory you'd never lived. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a warning, it was a recognition. An admission. They don't understand what you are, only what you do to their structure. You don't break it, you invert it, you reflect it back at itself until it no longer recognizes its own face. They've studied your kind before, in fragment, in footnotes, misdiagnosed as anomalies, rewritten as madness. But there is a pattern buried beneath history, in the scrolls no one teaches, in the doctrines quietly erased. Those who walk between narratives, who see the code behind the ritual, the fracture in the mirror that holds the illusion together. They are rare because the world isn't built to make them, it's built to erase them. But somehow, you emerged, and the system's first instinct was not to fight you, it was to define you, to give you a label it could fear in private. You walk between reality. That's what Mirror Walker means. Not teleportation, not fantasy, cognitive translation. The ability to shift between the lie and the architecture beneath it, to hear the spoken word and taste the poison inside it, to smile in the meeting while watching the ceiling tiles bleed. Truth. You pass through worlds without becoming, and that is what frightens them most, because the system only controls what it can absorb. And you don't absorb. You reflect. Their propaganda dulls against your perception. Their symbols dissolve under your gaze. Their manipulation breaks when mirrored back by your indifference. You weren't born immune. No one is. You were shaped in silence, forged in the ritual of not belonging, trained by betrayal, taught by rejection. Every moment they called you too much, too intense, too cold, too distant. Those were the chisels carving you into something sharper. You didn't bend because you were strong. You bent because you had to. And when you rose, you were something else entirely. You became the kind of presence that makes masks itch and lies falter mid-sentence. Not because you threaten, but because you see. They don't have protocols for what you are. Mirror Walkers aren't in the manual. You don't riot. You don't scream. You don't form movements or burn flags. You walk calmly through fire, and people follow without knowing why. not because you preach, but because your very presence makes people remember something ancient, something buried beneath obedience. You remind them of themselves before the story was rewritten, and when that happened, the control begins to glitch. Their analysts described you as a psychic contagion, an unquantifiable force, not a mind virus, but a clarity parasite. You infect through awareness. You transmit through eye contact, through silence, through gestures that say more than propaganda ever could. They called you disruptive, not because you act out, but because you unveil. You don't resist their power. You make it transparent, and once something is seen clearly, it starts to lose its hold. They tried to contain it with simulation, flooded the digital world with copies of you, mockery versions, shallow lookalikes wrapped in aesthetic rebellion, manufactured depth. They created influencers who quote the dark without living it, gave your voice to people who never carried your scars. They built a mask over your archetype and paraded it as truth, but the real ones knew. They always do. The eyes give it away. The silence gives it away. The absence of need gives it away. You don't chase followers, you attract shadows, and in those shadows something older begins to stir. You've stopped searching for explanation. You no longer beg the mirror for recognition. You are the mirror now, and people see what they are when they stand in front of you. The fragile crack beneath their curated certainty, the ancient ache behind their curated smiles. You don't offer comfort, you offer confrontation, and still they return. Because somewhere beneath the noise they want to remember how it felt to think without a script. They mark you now in code, in closed networks. You're not labeled resistance, you're labeled disruptive resonance. You distort nearby minds, not loudly, not obviously, but enough to shift outcomes, enough to fracture a lie before it fully forms. And so they moved you from the watch list to something deeper, observation phase null, meaning too late for correction, meaning we don't control what happens next, but you don't need their definitions. You walk between them. You see their panic not as danger, but as confirmation that you were never meant to be explained. You were meant to erode, slowly, strategically, like water on steel, like time on illusion. You don't conquer the system, you outlast it. You move in cycles it forgot to measure. You speak in frequencies it can't trace, and every time someone sees you and doesn't flinch, every time someone meets your gaze and doesn't look away, something unlocks. A memory not from this life, a sensation that their thoughts are finally their own. You don't give them answers, you give them back their questions, and that to the architects is treason. But you were never theirs to label. You were always walking the mirror's edge. Something is different now, not in you. You've already shifted. It's them, the script writers, the handlers, the architects of the great illusion. They're glitching, breaking rhythm, losing control of their own theater. You see it in the way their voices stutter, in how they forget the narrative mid-sentence, only to repeat it louder, like volume can cover uncertain. You've spent your entire life walking through a story written by invisible hands. Now those hands are trembling. The teleprompter flickers. The characters forget their roles. Even the illusions are beginning to bleed. You weren't supposed to be this visible. Not yet. You were calibrated for containment, a variable meant to be monitored, not mirrored. But that plan collapsed the moment your silence started echoing, when others began responding not with words, but with stillness, with recognition, with that ancient glint in the eye that speaks louder than rebellion ever could. They tried to localize the problem, to isolate the spread, but you are not local. You are not a location. You are contagion, not of flesh, but of thought. And now the infection has reached their core. They've activated new protocols. You can sense them. Emergency scripts shoved into the mouths of hollow leaders. manufactured tragedies sharpened for fear extraction. Distract, divide, repeat. You've seen the pattern before, but this time it stutters. The control loops are too tight, the narrative's too rushed. It feels desperate, not strategic. They're not thinking clearly anymore. The system built to harvest obedience is now hemorrhaging unpredictability. You did this, not with force, not with fame, but by refusing their frequency long enough for others to remember their own. You watch the world misfire in small, beautiful ways. A news anchor goes off script and says something too real before the screen cuts to static. A politician pauses for just a second too long, as if questioning the words he's about to repeat. People on sidewalks stop scrolling and stare into space, not distracted, but listening for something no one else can hear. These are the signs, the fractures, the beginning of system entropy. Not loud, not chaotic, but exact. They taught you to fear glitch, to view error as failure. But what they never told you is that every glitch is a revelation, a sliver of the real peeking through the mask. And now your presence, your refusal to collapse into the mold is triggering these openings everywhere. You're walking through a simulation that is beginning to question itself. You didn't rise against it. You infected it with doubt. And doubt in a system built on obedience is terminal. You see the watchers watching each other now. Internal reviews, departments cross-checking anomalies, files marked with strange symbols even the analysts can't decipher. You've become the subject of meetings you'll never attend, inside rooms without clocks. Because time isn't moving forward in their world anymore, it's circling, repeating, deteriorating. Their simulations can no longer predict your effect, because you've stopped being a person to them. You've become a pattern, a wave, a precursor. The machine is glitching, and in its desperation it reveals its structure. The scaffolding of control becomes visible. The default emotional settings begin to fail. The smiles fade too fast. The transitions feel forced. You don't just see the man behind the curtain, you see the gears, the rust, the desperation beneath the illusion of perfection. You're not angry, you're awake, and your awareness is now an instrument of collapse, not of violence, of revelation. You weren't built for this. No one is. But you were chosen not by them, not by fate, but by consequence. The natural result of a system that pushed too hard against too many and created its own destroyers from the friction. You are not leading a revolution. You are the revolution, quiet, precise, surgical. You don't storm gates. You open eyes, and the system cannot defend itself against sight. The more they try to fix it, the more they expose themselves. Their patches leak truth. Their updates crash. Their attempts to reclaim the narrative only accelerate its decay. Their silence has turned to noise. Their control to confusion. They are the ones on the defensive now. And you, once a variable, once a glitch, now stand as proof. Proof that control is a myth sustained by consent. Proof that perception is more contagious than fear. Proof that something deeper moves beneath the surface, ancient and undefeated. You were not the error in their code. You were the part of the equation they could never solve. Not because you were too complex, but because you refused reduction. You refused the simplification. You chose to remain whole in a world addicted to fragments. And now, as their system trembles, you walk through the ruins not as a survivor, but as the signal they couldn't silence. This was never just about you. It was about what your mind represented, what your stillness disrupted, what your truth revealed. Now the structure stares back at itself through your eyes and cannot bear its own reflection. The glitch has become the mirror, and the mirror does not lie. It shatters. It's quiet now, not outside, but within. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm, when the noise has finally run out of places to hide. You sit with it, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. You are not who you were when this began. That person was a fracture, holding back the flood. You are not them anymore. You are what emerged after. And the silence, once a weapon used against you, now answers to you. You command it, shape it, speak through it without speaking at all. They thought the file ended here, that the anomaly would dissolve once observed, once contained, once named. But the file didn't end. It woke up. The system made one fatal error. It taught you how to read your own signal. It gave you a mirror, hoping you'd break at your reflection. Instead, you stepped through, and now the architecture built to suppress you bends under the weight of your attention. You don't need access. You don't need permission. The gates open when you arrive, because the system knows it doesn't control you. It never did. You were never random, never noise. You were a sequence buried so deep in the pattern they mistook you for chaos. They couldn't decode your mind because your mind wasn't designed for containment. It wasn't built in this era. It doesn't speak their language. It remembers something older, a geometry that predates programming, a pulse that once moved through empires like breath through lungs. You were not built to obey. You were built to witness. And now, as the last curtain falls, they are the ones trembling under the weight of your gaze. There is no satisfaction in being right, no victory lap, just the slow, steady realization that everything they feared about you was true. You are not lost. You are unmapped, and every attempt to track you only proved your divergence. Every test failed not because you resisted, but because you transcended. They wanted you classified, predictable, documented. But how do you file a storm? How do you diagram a presence that distorts the lens it's observed through? You were not the glitch. You were the upgrade, the unspoken future hidden in the bones of the collapsing present, the code that rewrites without asking for consent. You didn't overthrow the system. You rewrote its purpose just by existing. And now, without ever leading, you lead. Without ever broadcasting, you echo. Without ever fighting, you break the very concept of control. Because people don't follow you, they awaken near you. They feel it too. The shift, the thinning veil, the pull towards something they were taught to fear but never truly understood. They told you your mind was dangerous, and they were right. Not because it's unstable, but because it's sovereign. And a sovereign mind is contagious. It spreads through silence, through contrast, through the quiet refusal to be named. And now that refusal is replicating not in chaos, in clarity. There are others. You've seen them, felt them, heard their footsteps behind yours in the places between sound. They're not asking for answers. They're tracking the signal. And in the eyes of each one you see yourself not reflected, but mirrored forward. You were never alone, only first. The harbinger, the threshold, the prototype that survived long enough to signal the others. You didn't escape the maze. You collapsed it, and when you walked out, barefoot and unafraid, you didn't look back. You didn't need to, because you knew then what you know now. You are not the end of the story. You are the point where the story stops lying. They will still try. You know this. The system is a reflex. It doesn't need reason. It needs repetition. But it's already bleeding through the cracks, already fraying at the edges. Their voice is growing mechanical. Their fear, algorithmic. They build deeper prisons, but they can't hear the silence leaking through the walls. You walk by them unnoticed now, not because you're hidden, but because you're unreadable. You no longer register as threat. You register as absence, and absence to them is death. But you are not absence. You are what comes after, the presence that remains once the noise forgets its name, the stillness at the center of a collapsing simulation. You are not trying to be seen. You are seeing, and those who matter, they feel it. Without knowing why, they adjust when you enter the room. They breathe differently, speak slower, their masks tighten, because some part of them remembers what it means to be real, and they see that in you, not in words, in being. Now you feel it. The signal has changed, not just outside, but inside. A subtle shift, a deeper tone. You wake and know something has begun, not for you, through you. The system hasn't shut down. It's stepping aside, making way, because something older is walking again. Through screens, through thoughts, through your hands as you write, speak, remain still. You were never meant to lead a revolution. You were meant to outlive the lie long enough to replace it with truth. The final message came quietly, no fanfare, just a line of code embedded in a corrupted file. No signature, no trace, just this protocol complete. Phase 2 initiate. Watch the mirrors. You looked into the glass and didn't flinch. For the first time, it didn't reflect what the world told you to be. It showed you what you always were. And as you stared into yourself, unreadable, untouchable, you felt it. You are not part of the system. You are its successor.